The inbred Prince Philip II had to lock away. There are some doors in history that should remain closed. Not because what lies behind them is mythical or magical, but because it is too human, too raw, too painful, too much like looking into a distorted mirror that shows us what power does to blood when blood marries blood too many times. The story of Prince Don Carlos of Spain, the eldest son of King Philip II, is one such door. It is not a fairy tale about a locked-away monster. It is worse. It is the true account of a boy born into the most powerful throne in the world, crippled by generations of cousin-to-cousin and uncle-to-niece unions, and finally sealed inside a suite of cold stone rooms in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid until his young body gave out. His father, the sternest king of his age, turned the key himself. To understand Don Carlos, one must first understand the house that made him. The Habsburgs had risen to dominate Europe not through the largest armies, but through marriage. Their motto was simple: Bella gerent alii, tu Felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry. And marry they did. Over and over, they married within the family tree until the branches knotted into a tangled, choking thicket. Philip II himself was the son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. That sounds innocent enough until you learn that Charles V was the son of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, Joanna being the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Meanwhile, Isabella of Portugal was Charles's first cousin once removed. Already the pool was shallow. But Don Carlos's lineage was even tighter. His mother was Maria Manuela of Portugal. She was Philip's first cousin. Her mother? Catherine of Austria, who was the sister of Emperor Charles V. In other words, Don Carlos's parents were nephew and aunt? No, let me slow down. Philip's father, Charles V, had a sister named Catherine. Catherine married King John III of Portugal. Their daughter was Maria Manuela. So Maria Manuela was Philip's first cousin, the child of his father's sister. That makes Don Carlos the product of a first cousin union. That alone is not catastrophic. But if you trace back 4 generations on both sides, you find the same few faces repeated: Juan of Castile, Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella of Castile, Manuel I of Portugal. The boy never had a chance. When Don Carlos was born on July 8, 1545, in Valladolid, the court rejoiced. Spain had a male heir. But the rejoicing lasted only 6 days. His mother, Maria Manuela, died of a hemorrhage, likely a postpartum fever, just as the candles for the christening were being lit. So before Don Carlos could even focus his infant eyes, he had no mother. His father, Philip, was then a young man of 18, already a prince of vast territories. He grieved in the way he would grieve all his life, by withdrawing into duty. He left the baby in the hands of nurses and governesses, and by the time Don Carlos was 4 years old, his father was away in the Low Countries, governing an empire that stretched from Sicily to the Netherlands to the Americas. The boy grew up without a mother's touch and largely without a father's presence. The women who raised him, his aunts, especially Maria of Austria and Joanna of Austria, were kind but had their own political burdens. And even as a toddler, something was wrong. The nurses whispered. His head was large, out of proportion to his body. His left shoulder sat higher than the right. He was slow to walk. When he finally did walk, he dragged one leg slightly. He had trouble feeding. His lower jaw jutted forward in the famous Habsburg prognathism, so severe in him that his teeth did not meet properly. He could not fully close his mouth. He drooled. He spoke with a lisp that became worse when he was excited or angry. And he was often angry. These are the facts. They are not cruel inventions. They are from the letters of his tutors and the observations of ambassadors who saw him at court. The Venetian envoy described him at age 10 as having a strange deformity of the body, not exactly a hunchback but a crookedness of the spine. Another said his face was sad and disturbing, with eyes that can look through a man. But physical deformity alone would not have led to what happened later. The deeper problem was in his mind, or perhaps in his spirit, broken by a combination of inherited fragility, neglect, and the impossible weight of being heir to half the world. He was intelligent in flashes, but the flashes were erratic. He learned Latin quickly but then refused to speak it. He devoured books on military history but could not sit still for a full lesson in mathematics. He loved weapons and tournaments but had such poor coordination that he often fell off his horse in public. When he fell, he did not laugh at himself. He raged. He would strike the grooms, bite his own hand until it bled, or run to his room and throw chairs against the walls. His tutors, a parade of learned men appointed by Philip, sent back reports that grew more alarmed with each year. By the time Don Carlos was 12, one tutor wrote directly to the king, "Your Highness, the prince has a temper that frightens even the old servants. He does not seem to understand that other people feel pain." That last part is chilling. It suggests something beyond mere anger. It suggests an absence of empathy, or at least a profound inability to regulate emotion, a wiring problem in the brain that the repeated consanguinity of the Habsburgs may have made worse. Modern geneticists looking at the family tree have calculated that the Habsburgs' inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related parents are, reached levels that would be considered incestuous in most societies. For Don Carlos, that coefficient was around 0.211. For comparison, the child of a brother-sister union is 0.25. He was nearly that. By the time he was 15, Don Carlos was already a problem his father could no longer ignore. Philip II had returned to Spain permanently in 1559 after a long absence, and he brought with him a new wife, Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess originally meant to marry Don Carlos himself. That betrothal had been swapped at the last moment because of politics. The girl was too valuable for a prince who might never rule, better to marry her to the king. So Elizabeth, at 14, became Philip's third wife. She was only a year older than Don Carlos. And Don Carlos, according to some sources, fell into a violent, obsessive, impossible love with his own stepmother. Whether that love was real or a product of his disordered mind is hard to say. The French ambassador reported that Don Carlos would loiter outside Elizabeth's chambers, whisper her name, and once tried to embrace her in the garden. Elizabeth, terrified, told the king. Philip did not punish his son immediately. Instead, he watched. He watched as Don Carlos began to show other signs of unraveling. The prince ordered servants to beat a cobbler who had brought him shoes a half size too small. He tried to throw a groom out of a window for failing to saddle his horse quickly enough. He announced at a state dinner that he intended to assassinate one of his father's ministers, not in secret, but aloud, in front of 30 guests, laughing as he said it. By 1567, Don Carlos was 22 years old. He should have been participating in the governance of the empire. Instead, he was a liability. Philip had tried everything short of imprisonment. He had given Don Carlos his own household, his own council, even a seat at the Council of State. But the prince either attended meetings and said nothing, or attended and shouted down every proposal. He demanded to be sent to the Netherlands to put down the growing Protestant rebellion. Philip refused, knowing Don Carlos's volatile nature would turn a difficult war into a catastrophe. In response, Don Carlos tried to flee Spain. He planned to go to Italy, or Germany, or anywhere his father was not. The breaking point came on the night of January 17, 1568. The story has many versions, but the core is consistent. Don Carlos had been confined to his apartments after another explosion of rage, this time threatening to kill a man named Alba, the Duke of Alba, a trusted general of the king. The prince sat up late that night, writing letters to foreign princes, begging for military help against his own father. He had also, it was discovered, hidden a stash of gold and jewels to fund his escape. Philip summoned him the next morning to the king's private chambers. What was said between them, no one knows for certain. The king's confessor later wrote that Philip spoke gently at first, asking his son to hand over any weapons or seditious letters. Don Carlos refused. He called his father a tyrant. He said he would rather die than be treated like a prisoner in his own home. Then Philip clapped his hands. The doors opened. Armed guards entered. They took Don Carlos by the arms. The prince screamed. He bit one of the guards on the hand. He shouted that he was the future king, that they had no right to touch him. But they dragged him out of the room, down a long corridor, up a spiral staircase, and into a set of rooms in the oldest part of the Alcázar, a small tower chamber that had once been used as a storage room for hunting equipment. The windows were narrow, set high in the thick stone walls. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands. A new lock was fitted that morning. The key was handed to the king. Philip put it on a chain around his own neck and wore it until the day his son died. That is not metaphor. That is fact. The king kept the key to his son's prison on his person at all times. He slept with it. He prayed with it. He never let it out of his sight. The imprisonment of Don Carlos was not a public event. The court was told that the prince was ill, too ill to appear in public, and that his doctors had ordered complete isolation. Some believed it. Many did not. The ambassadors from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire immediately began writing dispatches home, speculating wildly. The English ambassador, a man named John Mann, wrote that Don Carlos had been shut up for a conspiracy against the king's own person. The French ambassador added that the prince was mad, entirely mad, and has been so for many years. Philip issued a statement to the Castilian courts. The prince had been arrested for reasons that touched the service of God and the security of these kingdoms. It was vague and terrifying. No charges were ever formally read. No trial was held. Don Carlos was simply removed from the world, locked in a small suite of rooms in the tower, with only a handful of servants permitted to see him, all of them sworn to silence on pain of death. What were those rooms like? We have descriptions from the servants who later spoke, years after the fact, when the fear of punishment had faded. The prince's main chamber was roughly 15 feet by 20 feet, with a vaulted stone ceiling and a single fireplace that smoked constantly. The floor was flagstone, cold even in summer. A narrow bed with a straw mattress stood against one wall. A wooden table held a candle, a crucifix, and a few books, prayer books mostly, though someone had smuggled him a history of Julius Caesar. There was a chamber pot that was emptied once a day. The windows faced north, so no direct sunlight entered, only a grey, watery light that never quite reached the corners of the room. Don Carlos did not take this captivity quietly. For the first 2 weeks, he howled. Servants on the lower floors of the Alcázar heard him screaming at all hours, his voice hoarse and broken, sometimes shouting curses, sometimes sobbing like a child. He threw his food against the walls. He tore his clothes into strips and tried to tie them together into a rope. The guards cut the strips away and gave him only a coarse woolen shift to wear. He tried to set his mattress on fire using the candle. After that, the candle was taken away. He lived in darkness except for a small oil lamp that the guards lit only for meals. His father visited him exactly once. The king came on the 3rd day of the imprisonment, after the screaming had subsided into a low, continuous moaning. Philip entered the room alone. He stood by the door. Don Carlos was on his knees in the middle of the floor, rocking back and forth. When he saw his father, he stopped rocking and stared. The two looked at each other for what the guards later said felt like an eternity. Then Don Carlos spoke. His voice was thin. He said, "You are not my father. My father died when I was a child. You are just a king who stole my crown." Philip did not answer. He turned and walked out. He locked the door again. He never went back. From that point on, the prince's existence was managed by a small team, one priest, one doctor, 4 servants who rotated in 12-hour shifts, and a guard of 6 soldiers who stood outside the door at all times. The priest, Fray Diego de Chavez, was a severe man who believed that Don Carlos's madness was divine punishment for the pride of the Habsburgs. He heard the prince's confessions, or tried to. Don Carlos would either refuse to speak or would confess to bizarre, impossible crimes, such as having poisoned the wells of a city he had never visited. The priest dutifully recorded everything and sent weekly reports to the king. The doctor, a Portuguese physician named Dionisio Doza Chacon, was more compassionate. He examined the prince regularly and wrote detailed notes about his physical decline. Within 3 months of imprisonment, Don Carlos had lost 1/3 of his body weight. His skin was pale gray. The joints of his fingers were swollen and stiff, possibly from scurvy, since the food given to him was minimal and lacked fresh fruit. He refused to eat for days at a time, then would eat ravenously, then vomit everything back up. He had episodes where he would stare at a wall for hours, motionless, not responding to his name. Then he would suddenly leap up, run at the door, and throw himself against it until his shoulders and forehead were bruised and bleeding. One of the servants, a woman named Leonor de Mascarenhas who had known Don Carlos since he was a child, risked everything to beg the king for mercy. She found Philip in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. She touched his sleeve. He flinched. She whispered, "Sire, your son is dying. He is not a beast. He is your blood." Philip looked at her with eyes that showed no emotion. He said, "He is the king's blood. That is why he must be kept safe. From himself." Then he returned to his prayers. There is a kind of love that looks like cruelty from the outside. Perhaps Philip believed he was saving his son from execution, because the alternative to imprisonment would have been a public trial and, almost certainly, a death sentence for treason. In the 16th century, a prince who conspired with foreign powers against his own father had no future. Philip may have thought the tower was mercy. But mercy that kills slowly is still killing. The months passed. Summer came to Madrid, hot and dry. The tower room became an oven. Don Carlos stopped wearing clothes entirely. He lay naked on the stone floor, pressing his cheek against the cool rock, whispering fragments of old conversations no one else could hear. He asked repeatedly for a horse. He asked for his stepmother, Elizabeth. He asked for his mother, dead these 22 years. He seemed to confuse past and present. Once, he greeted a servant as if the servant were his grandfather, Emperor Charles V, who had died a decade earlier. In late July 1568, Don Carlos began to suffer from a fever that would not break. Doza Chacon diagnosed it as a tertian ague, malaria-like, though malaria was common in Spain. He bled the prince, as doctors did. He gave him infusions of quinine bark. Nothing worked. The fever climbed. Don Carlos's teeth chattered even as his skin burned. He stopped eating altogether. He drank only water, and then only when the priest held the cup to his lips. On the night of July 24th, the prince asked to see his father. The request was carried to Philip, who was in his own bedchamber, reading dispatches from the Netherlands. Philip set down the papers. He looked at the messenger, one of his most trusted secretaries, Mateo Bosques. "Tell my son," Philip said slowly, "that I will see him in heaven." Then he added, "Make sure the priest stays with him until the end." Those were the last words Philip ever spoke about his son that anyone recorded. Don Carlos died at dawn on July 25, 1568. He was 23 years old. The official cause of death was given as a malignant fever brought on by the prince's excessive humors and his refusal to follow medical advice. No autopsy was performed, although the king's physician later wrote privately that the prince's internal organs were strangely formed, especially the heart, which was larger than normal and misshapen. That could have been a symptom of a congenital disorder, one more inheritance from the tangled Habsburg line. The body was dressed in a simple Franciscan habit, the same kind of robe that the king himself would wear in his own final years. It was laid in a lead coffin and placed in the royal crypt at El Escorial, the massive monastery palace that Philip had built partly as a tomb for his dynasty. The coffin was small. There was no state funeral, no public mourning. The king issued a brief statement: "The prince has departed this life. Let us pray for his soul." And then, as if closing a book, Philip returned to the business of ruling his empire. But the story did not end there. Because a prince locked away in a tower does not simply vanish. Rumors spread across Europe within weeks. The Protestant enemies of Spain seized on the story and transformed it into legend. In the Dutch Republic, pamphlets appeared claiming that Don Carlos had been murdered by his father, strangled, or poisoned, or bled to death by doctors under orders. A German writer named Friedrich Schiller would later turn the story into a play, Don Carlos, in which the prince is a noble, freedom-loving hero destroyed by a cruel, fanatical king. In that version, there is no deformity, no madness, no biting of guards or throwing of food. There is only a beautiful young man who dared to love his stepmother and dream of liberty, and a father who could not bear it. The truth is harder. The truth is that Don Carlos was not a hero or a monster. He was a profoundly damaged human being, damaged by genetics, by neglect, by the impossible weight of being born to rule when he could barely rule himself. His body betrayed him at every turn. His mind was a chamber of storms. And his father, for all his piety and his insistence that he acted for the good of the realm, could find no other solution than the key on the chain around his neck. There is one final detail that haunts. In the archives of Simancas, buried among thousands of letters, there is a short note written by Philip II in his own hand, dated August 1568, 1 week after his son's death. It is a note to the prior of El Escorial, instructing him to say a daily mass for the soul of Don Carlos. But at the bottom, in a different ink, perhaps added later, Philip wrote, "And let them pray also for me. For I have done what no father should have to do, and I do not know if God will forgive it." He kept the key. After Don Carlos died, Philip did not remove the chain from his neck for another day. Then he took it to a blacksmith and had the key melted down into a small cross, which he wore inside his shirt for the rest of his life. When Philip himself died in 1598, that cross was found on his chest, under his armor, next to a lock of hair that had belonged to his son. The door to the tower room was eventually opened, years later, when the Alcázar was renovated. The servants who went in found nothing remarkable: a cold fireplace, a broken bed, a single Latin word scratched into the stone wall above the window. That word was libertas, freedom. Whether Don Carlos scratched it there in a moment of hope or of despair, no one knows. But it remained until the Alcázar burned down in 1734, and the tower room crumbled into ash. The Habsburg line continued to marry cousin to cousin for another century. Each generation produced children a little more fragile, a little more distorted, a little less able to rule. The last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, was so physically and mentally disabled that he could not chew his own food and never learned to speak clearly. He died childless in 1700, ending the dynasty that had once dominated the world. By then, the lesson should have been clear: blood that turns in on itself eventually runs dry. But the story of Don Carlos is not just a lesson in genetics. It is a story about what happens when love becomes control, when duty becomes cruelty, and when a father looks at his son and sees not a child but a threat to the crown. Philip II locked away his own flesh because he could not bear to look at the living proof of what his family had become. The prince in the tower was a mirror, and the king could not stand the reflection. So we remember Don Carlos not as the monster of legend, nor as the hero of romantic tragedy, but as a broken young man in a cold stone room, scratching one word into the wall with his fingernail, waiting for a father who would not come, until the fever took him and the key was melted down and the door was closed for the last time. And somewhere in the archives of Spain, between the treaties of war and the ledgers of gold from the Americas, there is still a small wooden box labeled Relics of the Prince Don Carlos. Do not open without the king's permission. The box has not been opened in more than 400 years. But if you hold it up to your ear, the archivists say, you can hear a faint scratching sound, like a fingernail on stone, spelling out a word that no king can ever lock away. The key and the cross. The morning after Don Carlos died, Philip II did not rise at his usual hour. The king's bedchamber in the Alcázar of Madrid was a severe room, white walls, a small crucifix above the headboard, a single window facing east toward the Guadarrama Mountains. On most days, Philip was awake by 4, already kneeling at his prie-dieu, already writing notes to his ambassadors in Rome or Brussels or Vienna. But on July 26, 1568, the servants heard nothing from behind the heavy oak door. No rustle of papers. No murmured prayers. No sharp call for hot chocolate, a drink the king had recently grown fond of, thickened with egg yolk and sweetened with sugar from the New World. At 7, his chief valet, a man named Juan de Soto, dared to knock softly. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. De Soto pressed his ear to the door and heard a sound he had never heard from his master in 20 years of service, a low, uneven breathing, like a man who had been crying for hours and had forgotten how to stop. When the valet finally entered, using the master key kept in the antechamber, he found Philip sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed in his usual black wool suit, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes open but unfocused. On the small table beside the bed lay the iron key to Don Carlos's tower room. Next to it, a pair of scissors. And next to the scissors, a single lock of reddish-brown hair, the prince's hair, cut from the corpse before the coffin was sealed. Philip looked up at his valet. His face was not the face of a king. It was the face of a man who had just buried his only son. "Juan," he said, his voice flat, "bring me a hammer. And a blacksmith." The blacksmith came to the Alcázar that afternoon, a thick-armed Basque named Motín de Ocares who had made horseshoes for the royal stables for 30 years. He was led through a maze of corridors, past guards who did not meet his eyes, into a small workshop attached to the king's private chapel. There he found the king himself waiting, the iron key on an anvil that had been brought in just for this purpose. Philip did not explain. He simply pointed to the key and said, "Melt this. Shape it into a cross. Small enough to wear against the skin." The blacksmith hesitated. It was an odd request, and the key was clearly not an ordinary key. It was heavier than most, the teeth worn smooth from daily use, the iron still smelling faintly of oil. But he did as he was told. He built a charcoal fire in the forge. He pumped the bellows until the key glowed orange, then white. He watched as the metal softened and slumped, the shape of the lock teeth dissolving into a bright pool of liquid iron. Then he poured the iron into a small clay mold he had carved in the shape of a Latin cross. When the metal cooled, the cross was rough, dark, unadorned. No gold, no jewels, no inscription. Just a plain iron cross, still warm from the forge, with a small loop at the top for a chain. Philip took it in his hands. He turned it over once. Then he threaded a leather cord through the loop and tied it around his neck, letting the cross fall against his chest, hidden beneath his shirt. He wore that cross for the rest of his life, 30 more years, through 3 more marriages, through the annexation of Portugal, through the defeat of the Spanish Armada, through the slow, grinding decay of his own body. It never left his skin. When he bathed, the servants saw it, dark against his pale chest. When he prayed, his fingers often strayed to it unconsciously, tracing the rough edges. Sometimes, in the middle of a council meeting, the king's hand would rise to his collar, touch the cord beneath, and his eyes would drift away for a moment, out the window, toward the tower where his son had died. No one ever asked him about it. No one dared. The court returned to a semblance of normalcy within weeks. Elizabeth of Valois, the young stepmother Don Carlos had so obsessively loved, gave birth to 2 daughters in the following years, but never a son. She died in 1568 as well, only 3 months after Don Carlos, from complications of a miscarriage. Philip wept at her bedside, the second time in his life he had watched a young wife bleed to death. Then he dried his eyes and went to his desk. The empire did not pause for grief. He married again, for the 4th time. Anna of Austria was his niece, the daughter of his sister, Maria of Austria, and Emperor Maximilian II. She was 20 when they married, born in 1549. Philip was 43. The match was purely dynastic. Anna's womb was needed to produce male heirs, because the only surviving son of Philip at that point was a sickly infant from another marriage. But Anna was also, biologically, Philip's own niece. The bloodlines were tightening again. Anna gave Philip 4 sons and a daughter. One son, the future Philip III, survived infancy. 2 died as toddlers. Another, named Ferdinand, died at the age of 7 from dysentery. Anna herself died in 1580, at just 31 years old, worn out by repeated pregnancies and the endless funereal atmosphere of the Spanish court. Philip buried her in El Escorial, in the same cold crypt where Don Carlos already lay. Then he married once more, his 4th wife, his 4th attempt, a 20-year-old Austrian archduchess named Margaret. She bore him 2 more children, including a son who would die in childhood. By the end of his life, Philip II had outlived all 4 of his wives and all but one of his legitimate children. The sole surviving son, Philip III, was a sweet-natured but weak-willed young man who loved dancing and court spectacles more than governance. He had the Habsburg jaw, of course, the heavy lower lip, the difficulty chewing, but he was not, by the standards of the family, deformed. He was simply average. And average, for a Habsburg king, was almost a miracle. But the price of that average child was decades of inbreeding that left psychological scars deeper than any physical deformity. Philip II had been raised by a stern father who was often absent. He had become, in turn, a stern father who was often absent, except when he was present, and then he was terrifying. The pattern was set. The locked tower was not an anomaly. It was the logical endpoint of a family that had learned to treat its own members as political problems to be solved, not as human beings to be loved. The tower room itself was sealed after Don Carlos's death. Not locked, sealed. Philip ordered a mason to brick up the doorway, turning the chamber into a small, inaccessible void within the walls of the Alcazar. The servants whispered that the prince's ghost walked the corridor outside, dragging one leg, moaning in Latin. The king heard these whispers and did nothing to stop them. Perhaps he thought the ghost was just. For 30 years, the bricked-up door remained hidden behind a tapestry of the crucifixion. No one went in. No one came out. The room became a hole in the memory of the court, known to exist, but never mentioned aloud. When new servants were hired, they were told, simply, "Do not remove the tapestry. Do not knock on the wall." That was all. In 1598, Philip II knew he was dying. He was 71 years old, but he looked 90. His body had turned against him in the same slow, systematic way that his son's body had failed. He suffered from gout so severe that his hands were twisted into claws, the fingers bent at unnatural angles. He had a form of arthritis that made every joint ache. His skin was yellowed from what historians now believe was probably a chronic liver condition, possibly hemochromatosis, another genetic disorder common in inbred populations. He could no longer walk without help. He was carried from room to room in a wooden chair, his swollen feet wrapped in linen soaked in cold water. But his mind remained sharp, too sharp, perhaps. In his final months, he became obsessed with the idea of confession. He confessed not just his sins, but his decisions. He reviewed every major action of his reign with his confessor, Fray Diego de Yepes, the same man who had once attended Don Carlos in the tower. And again, the conversation returned to the prince. "Father," Philip said one evening, lying on a cot in his bedchamber, the iron cross still around his neck, "tell me truthfully. Was there another way?" The confessor knew what he meant. He had been asking himself the same question for 3 decades. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "you could have sent him to a monastery. You could have confined him to a distant castle with gardens and fresh air. You did not have to keep him in a dry tower with no sunlight." Philip closed his eyes. He would have run away. He would have gone to the Protestants. He would have raised an army against me. You know this. You saw his rages. "I saw a sick boy," the confessor said. "Not a traitor." The king said nothing for a long time. Then he reached up and touched the iron cross beneath his shirt. "Perhaps," he whispered, "perhaps that is worse. Because a traitor I could have killed cleanly. A sick boy I could only lock away and watch die slowly. And I did watch, Father. Every day, through the reports. I knew when he stopped eating. I knew when he stopped speaking. I knew when he began to scratch that word on the wall. And I did nothing." "What word?" the confessor asked, startled. He had not been told about the scratching. Philip's voice dropped to barely a breath. "Libertas. Freedom." He scratched libertas into the stone. My son, dying of thirst and fever, scratched the word for freedom on the wall of his prison. And I had the key around my neck. All that time. I could have opened the door. I could have let him walk in the garden one last time. I could have held his hand. But I was afraid. Afraid that if I opened the door, he would spit in my face. And I could not bear that. So I let him die without seeing my face again." The confessor had no answer. He simply made the sign of the cross and began the prayer for the dying, even though the king would linger for 2 more months. Philip II of Spain died on September 13, 1598, in the same bedchamber where he had once sat with his son's hair and his melted key. His last word according to the monks who surrounded him was Jesus. But one servant, a young man who had known Don Carlos as a child, later claimed that just before the king's breathing stopped, he whispered something else. Something that sounded like Carlos. The servant told no one for 20 years, and when he finally spoke, no one believed him. The king's body was dressed in the black wool suit he had worn for decades, his favorite, the same suit he had worn the morning his son died. The iron cross was still around his neck. No one dared remove it. He was placed in a lead coffin and carried to El Escorial, where his coffin was stacked in the royal pantheon alongside those of his 4 wives, his 5 children who had died in infancy, and his son Don Carlos. The bricked-up tower room in the Alcázar remained sealed for another 136 years. Then, in 1734, a fire broke out in the kitchens and spread quickly through the old palace. The flames consumed tapestries, ceilings, entire wings of the building. The tower where Don Carlos had died was among the last parts to burn. The thick stone walls held back the fire longer than the wooden floors and roofs of the newer sections. But eventually, the heat cracked the brickwork, and the sealed doorway crumbled. The room inside, exposed to the open air for the first time since 1568, was instantly consumed by the inferno. The word libertas, scratched into the stone, disappeared into ash. When the fire was finally extinguished, workers clearing the rubble found a single object in the ruins of the tower, a small iron cross, melted and twisted out of shape, half buried in the debris. It could not have been Philip's cross, that had gone to El Escorial with his body. But it was the same shape, the same crude iron. Some said it was the original key, that the cross worn by the king had been a replica, and that the true key cross had been hidden in the tower room as a kind of offering to the dead prince. Others said it was just a random piece of melted metal, and the story was a fairy tale. No one knows. The iron blob was thrown into a box of other fire-damaged relics and eventually lost. The Alcázar was rebuilt, and the new palace, the Royal Palace of Madrid that stands today, does not contain the tower room. The ground floor was raised, the walls were moved, the geometry of the old castle was erased. You can walk through the Royal Palace now, through its gilded halls and chandeliered ballrooms, and find no trace of the narrow staircase, the oak door, the cold flagstone floor. But the archives remain. In the Archivo General de Simancas, there is a drawer labeled Príncipe Don Carlos, Asuntos Secretos. Inside that drawer is a sheaf of documents: the prince's birth record, his tutor's reports, the letters from foreign ambassadors describing his outbursts, the king's terse order for the imprisonment, and, most haunting of all, a small piece of parchment with a single sentence in Philip's own hand, written in a shaky script that suggests tears. Hoy he encerrado a mi hijo. Que Dios me perdone. Today I locked away my son. May God forgive me. The story did not die with Philip, nor with the fire. It grew. In the centuries after Don Carlos's death, writers and artists became obsessed with the locked-away prince. The English dramatist Thomas Otway wrote a play, Don Carlos, Prince of Spain, in 1676, portraying the prince as a romantic hero betrayed by a jealous father. The German poet Friedrich Schiller turned the story into a 5-act tragedy in 1787, adding the famous character of the Marquis of Posa, a freedom-fighting friend of the prince who never actually existed. In Schiller's version, Don Carlos is not deformed, not mad, not violent. He is the noblest man in the court, destroyed by the tyranny of his father and the Inquisition. Then came Giuseppe Verdi. In 1867, the Italian composer turned Schiller's play into an opera, Don Carlo, one of the longest and most emotionally devastating works in the operatic repertoire. In Verdi's version, the prince sings of liberty, of love, of a world where men are not locked away for dreaming of a better future. The final act ends with the ghost of Emperor Charles V rising from his tomb to rescue the prince from the Inquisition, a supernatural escape that the real Don Carlos never had. All these versions are beautiful. All of them are lies. The real Don Carlos was not a hero. He was not a freedom fighter. He was a young man with a crooked spine, a malformed jaw, and a brain that could not regulate its own impulses. He was the product of a family that had mistaken inbreeding for dynastic security. And his father, the most powerful man in the world, had no better solution for him than a locked door and a key on a chain. But here is the strange thing. In making the legend more beautiful, in turning a damaged prince into a martyr for liberty, the artists may have stumbled upon a deeper truth. Don Carlos scratched libertas into the stone because he wanted out of his cage. That desire for freedom was real, even if the prince himself was too broken to know what freedom would look like. And his father, for all his power, was also a prisoner of duty, of fear, of a family curse he could not break. The Habsburg curse was not a spell. It was a genealogy. It was written in blood and bone, in chromosomes and collarbones, in the shape of a jaw that made eating difficult and a spine that made walking painful. Philip II could not unlock his son's cage without unlocking the truth about himself, that he, too, was inbred. That he, too, carried the damaged genes. That if Don Carlos was a monster, Philip had helped make him. That is why he kept the key. That is why he wore it as a cross. He was not just mourning his son. He was carrying the weight of what he had done, and what he was. The last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, was born in 1661, nearly a century after Don Carlos died. Charles II could not walk until he was 8. He could not speak clearly until he was 10. He was so weak as a child that doctors feared he would die at any moment. He had the Habsburg jaw so severely that his teeth never met, and he could not chew solid food. His tongue was so large that he was constantly drooling. He had seizures. He was bald by 30. He was impotent, unable to produce an heir. When he died in 1700, an autopsy reportedly found that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines full of rotting food he had been unable to digest. The dynasty ended not with a bang, but with a weak cough in a dark bedroom. And somewhere in the chain of those failed bodies, in the long line of cousins marrying cousins, the ghost of Don Carlos walked. Because Charles II was not a tragedy that came from nowhere. He was the final verse of a song that had begun with Philip II and his locked-away son. The tower was not an anomaly. It was a prophecy. If you stand today in the crypt of El Escorial, in the pantheon of the princes where the bodies of Habsburg infants and heirs are stacked in small niches like books on a shelf, you can find Don Carlos's coffin. It is unmarked, just one lead box among many, nestled between his half-brothers and his infant nieces. The guide will not stop there. The tourists will not linger. But if you look closely, you can see that the coffin is slightly smaller than the others. And if you put your ear to the stone wall behind it, or so the old keepers say, you can still hear a faint scratching. Libertas! 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 The prince in the tower is gone. But the key remains, melted into a cross, worn against a dead king's chest, buried in the rubble of a fire. The door is open now, because the door no longer exists. And freedom, at last, has come. Not the freedom Don Carlos dreamed of, not horses and gardens and a stepmother's smile, but a different freedom. The freedom of having the story told. The freedom of being seen, not as a monster or a hero, but as a boy who suffered, who raged, who scratched one word into stone with his fingernail, and who died alone. That is the freedom that outlasts kings. That is the key that no lock can hold.